Hi all, this is Santiago Garay and welcome to tutorial number 2 of SkinDesigner. This time we are getting a little bit more, let's say, advanced on the type or the variable panel size solutions. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways, or at least conceptually speaking, a couple of different ways that we can create facades that they include panels that are not the same size. By default, the typical panels, they have to have the same dimensions when we plug into the skin generator. And then there's a couple ways that we actually are overriding that behavior, right? So first one is using PanelBase. So let's go and look at that first option here. And I'll show you first the type of panels that I created. So we have the panel viewer shown here. There's a vertical solid panel with a simple wall component. The second one is a window that has a negative recess, so it's a projecting window with also our same panel wall system and shading, a vertical shading. The last one here is a little more involved. We're gonna see that now for a second. There's another, in this case, a curtain wall system, and you can see that so it's a spandrel behind the solid, but I did a couple of things with the mullion cap. So I put this overall setting on cap thickness on 0, but then I can have more specificity on these more other options like vertical panel caps, and added that different dimension here so I can see the verticals happening there. All right, so the other things, I have a custom geometry component, which is basically a link to that, a few solids that I created to represent somewhat of some type of terracotta baguettes, and I'll scale them there, place them orientation with the orientation of the Y dimension, so it's going up the Y of that geometry here, basically there. So that's considered the Y dimension, the up dimension, and then just tiling and cropping so it doesn't extend beyond the panel size in this case. The other thing I'm gonna add here, that probably is just to show an extra trick here, a tip that would be useful for many of you guys, is the idea of having actual direct function calls to the panel. So the panel API, so the panel itself has a lot of different functionality that is not necessarily exposed with components, but in this case, for instance, to add a mullion, a vertical mullion, at the end of the day, it's just a line of text that has a few parameters, right? And I'm making this a little more user-friendly by having the text with these replaced, these values so you can independently add them, like the direction and the distance from the left, and the actual width of that mullion. Okay, so with that information that I'm creating here, just plug in that text into that definitions input, and you'll see how that mullion actually is recreated and represented there. FYI, if you are not scared about reading code, this is the panel API you see in this component, the SkinDesigner component, and you can actually go and add your own calls using this format. Okay, and feel free to look at those and see if you want to have any specific kind of functionality. You could do that in a format similar to this, I guess. At least for the ones that they are into more advanced things, you can really look at that and add a little things like this one in your scripts. All right, so we have the panels. Now let's get into actual PanelBase. What are the PanelBase? Okay, so in the construction section, you'll see this PanelBase input or component. And basically what this is at the end of the day, it's just a group of panels. So you can connect your 3 panels created. All right, and let's display those so we see the PanelBase can also be used in the panel viewer. Now we see how that panels grouped look like, and then with a list of the panel names that you have on your panels, you can actually arrange that based on those panel names, arrange that the way you want. Okay, so we're gonna use that same group of panels and just override your, create different patterns with this already created list of names. Okay, so now we have 3 different groups that they are in different order, these panels. That way now we can have this variety, and the main, the key thing that I forgot to mention is that these panels are different widths in this case, right? So at least you can have different width dimensions with PanelBase. But at the end of the day, these dimensions, the overall dimensions are the same. All right, I'm assuring that in this case because they are the same panels that I'm just using once and arrange them just differently. But you could, have different panels and repeat panels and anything you want as far as the overall dimension is the same, and that's the requirement. Now, because at the end of the day, when you're connecting this PanelBase here in the skin generator, they are all the same dimension. All right, so let's see. Now that we have this, I think we can just run our solution. Turning on the skin generator, gonna map these panels, and you see it. There you go, all stacked, because even though there are different dimensions, they will exactly repeat every row. So you get some variation here, but definitely not not changing and stacked as you go up. Now the other thing is they have an offset here of 3. Don't necessarily have to do that. It's just something I left there. Some of the things you can do, I guess, with PanelBase. When you select these, are still individual panels, but definitely they are grouped based on these arrangements. All right, so now we can do something that will actually show a little bit more of that variation by having a panel function. Let's say you have this pattern between the PanelBase. You can just use that in your PanelBase, and now you see how. Now you see a little more of that, variation is happening based on a pattern that we're specifying here. All right, so this is basically using different panels in different rows. We're gonna just use something more like a random version, I guess. That would be a little more, even more variation as you see these panels expressed around. So that tells you more clearly how your panels are not stacked, but you see maybe there are lines where those groups of panels always are gonna coincide. Okay, so there's certain grid happening between every group of panels, but there's a lot of conditions where they are not aligning in between those panels. All right, so that's one thing. We can actually add just another for sake of showing variation or complexity, where you can limit this randomness to the areas of, let's say, this facade object that we created here. Okay, so is that visible? Hopefully, but yeah, that's the way you can go about with this setup with PanelBase. All right, so there's pros and cons. You compare with the other option. You look at this now, this is option number 2, and see which one works for you. All right, so in this case we have a surface. Let's go there, and in this case we have a surface that we actually have. We can use tools like any tools or any script within Grasshopper, like in this case we're using Lunchbox, to create the panelization in the surface. So SkinDesigner basically can both do the subdivision of a regular facade if you plug in directly the surface there, but also could use your facade, let's say pre-divided or pre-subdivided facade elements by connecting the surfaces straight to the this SkinDesigner surface input. Okay, so in this case the surface, I'm just doing some simple script that actually is eliminating the elements that are outside of my trim surface but that's all it is at the end, right? And then we have this subdivided facade. I'm linking that straight to this input, as I was saying. The other thing that is important in this workflow is that you have to create a panel that is the the maximum width and height of your surfaces, okay, of your pre-divided, subdivided facade. So I'm using that as a way to just grab the two maximum values and creating this panel. All right, that's all. In this case, it's a simple panel that has a couple of sunshades, vertical and horizontal, and a window. The other thing that is probably important to note is that my window is actually has dimensions relative to your panel width and height. So if the things change, the panel width or dimensions change, this window will be adjusting according to that. All right, so I think with that, I think we could just turn this skin generator on and see this in action. So there we go. So each panel of the subdivided, Lunchbox subdivided facade is creating a panel in SkinDesigner. All right, and the only thing you can see that maybe is not as desirable is when you have smaller panels like these ones that definitely doesn't make sense to have windows, I believe. But yes, the solution is pretty straightforward, and it will create as many panel types. It's the same panel, but create this mini panel or sub panel type, I guess, depending on your dimensions of your panel. This is a lot more flexible in that it could be stacked, could be variable in both height and width. Anything you want when you're doing your pre-divided, subdivided facade, that there will be doable with this approach. Now, one more thing I can show you, as well as I show you the these panel actions with adding a mullion on the component on the other option. Here we can also tapping again to this idea of the API or the panel API. You can add rules. In this case, the rules are simply saying, for instance, delete window and panels that they're less than 3 feet. Okay, so that's a text, and I can just connect that again to that panel. So as this panel is being used to create these different versions, it will run that rule, and then you'll see how that results in not having these windows on these panels of less than 3 feet. Okay, so panel width of less than 3 feet, you get basically the same finish without the window. So that is a simple way to go around this different type of more flexible, more, let's say, versatile type of panel dimensions. All right, so with that, I think we're done with these two main kind of strategies about creating variable panel sizes. One last thing though, before we finish, not gonna explain this, it's just showing you a little bit of where things going and how flexible we can get if we want. But this is a very simple solution. I mean, just turning this one on. In this case, we're showing how you can actually use custom geometry and custom panels to create forms that are not necessarily even rectangular. Okay, now these are just maybe very, very rudimentary versions of those facades. It's not trying to replace something that is generated more accurately, because there are some limitations, but you'll see where things going if you use some of these custom geometry capabilities. All right, so this is using just a diamond shaped panel that you can just create with custom geometry, and I have this panel here. Basically, is that this geometry here? It's two objects. It's one representing the glass and then the frame. But basically, that is what is linked here. And there, I'm gonna have this entire script on Hydra, so you guys can download it here, because some of these things probably you won't be able to have. In this case, you are also applying this custom geometry to the VREPs to the custom geometry component, and it's actually I can even add layers for each that will come up in its own layers on the skin here, and that's why they have different materials. Okay, so that's another thing, but basically not going through this too much, is saying this is just a quick thing, and you see there's some limitations because this is a rigid diamond shape, so there's going to be then differences as the normals of each of these panels are more different between them. Okay, so this is trying to be more of a simple, generalized way to do quick versions of these other shaped panels. Okay, but also you cannot doesn't trim on the side on the edges perfectly. All right, but I'm curious to see what you guys think about developing more of these other not conventional panel types. SkinDesigner has focused a lot on more traditional facade systems, but if there's users definitely interested on developing more of these other shaped forms and more complex forms, definitely there's what is called dynamic components and or dynamic geometry in SkinDesigner. We have one here that actually comes as an example, but basically this is the controller, and there's a example here, so you can create a panel type or typical or a panel form based on actual parameters that you can control and during runtime. Okay, so you could have more advanced solutions that could be the more accurate versions of things like this ones. All right, so if people are interested, it's not like SkinDesigner is developed as a platform where you can actually add anything to it, as far as we add these panel components that will plug in to the geometry of the custom geometry component, and that would we'll get to more sophisticated solutions. So I'm curious to see what you guys think about that, and your needs if you have on your projects. Okay, so I think we're done with this overall tutorial number 2, and then it's kind of view of different panel forms and shapes and organizations. Hopefully you find this useful. As I said, again, I will upload this to the Hydra website if you are interested to play with this, and I'm happy to know how you're doing with this, if you find it useful, and any questions you might have, if you're interested on developing some of these techniques in your projects. All right, thank you.